Hey class, in this video lecture we'll talk about routine messages. We'll start out by talking about what routine messages are. We'll then talk about how to structure an effective routine message. And finally, we'll look at some sample routine messages. So let's start by talking about what routine messages are. Not surprisingly, routine messages are routine. That's an admittedly circular tautological definition, but it's also an accurate one. Routine messages are the kinds of messages that we send all the time in business and in our workplaces. A good rule of thumb that I use for determining if a message is indeed a routine message is to ask myself, will this message make my audience mad? Will it make them sad? Will it upset them? And if the answer to those questions is no, chances are I'm writing a routine message. Routine messages are incredibly versatile. You can use them for a wide variety of purposes. You can use them to make requests. You can use them to ask or to answer questions. You can use them to provide information, to schedule meetings, to check in on something or update someone. You can use them to deliver announcements. You can use them to thank somebody or follow up on something. You can use them for all of these purposes and many more. Again, they're incredibly versatile. But how do you structure them? The most important thing that you need to know about structuring routine messages is that 95 to 99% of the time, they're front-loaded. By which I mean their main point should appear in the first, let's say, 1 to 5 sentences. Okay? That is the defining structural characteristic of most routine messages. They're front-loaded. Their main point appears at the beginning of the message. If you have additional context or details that you want to supply your audience with, you would then put that after rather than before your main point. And if your message is particularly lengthy or complex, you'd want to circle back around at the end and provide a summative conclusion of your main point. It's that simple, right? Start out with your main point, then provide supporting context or details, and if your message is particularly long, provide a summary at the end. But as with any rule, there are exceptions to this one. We've got a minor exception that I want to talk about and a major exception. So the minor exception is this. When necessary, you can include an introduction or minor context before your main point in a routine message. Remember from a few slides back, we said that you can delay the arrival of your main point until the 4th or 5th sentence if necessary. You would use that approach if you wanted to introduce yourself, for instance, to your reader, or if you wanted to provide a little bit of context that helps set the scene for your main point or for your major context. All right, so that's one minor exception that you can take to the direct routine message structure that we talked about before. Now let's talk about the major exception. So the major exception to the direct approach to routine messages is this. You should take an indirect approach if your message is strange or unexpected. Now, this only applies when that strange or unexpected information is not upsetting, right? If your message is upsetting, it's no longer a persuasive message. But if your main point isn't upsetting, but it is strange or unexpected, then you want to flip the order of the message around, begin with your context, and then get to your main point. That'll help fully set the scene for your strange or unexpected purpose before you actually get to that strange or unexpected purpose. So that's how you structure a routine message. Now let's look at some sample routine messages. This first example is a direct routine message that does not include a closing summary. And rather than reading this whole message in full aloud, what I'd like you to do is to pause this video, take a few moments to read this message, and then resume when you're finished. You can do that now. Okay, now that you've read this message in full, let's look at some of the key features. So the first thing, the most important thing to point out is that the main point, that's the green text, appears at the beginning of this message. This is a classic example of a very front-loaded, very direct routine message. We then move on to the supporting context and details in the red text. And then finally, in the violet text at the end, we have some closing goodwill. That's not a feature of routine messages per se, but it's something important to include in pretty much all business communication. So I threw it in here. Now let's look at another direct routine message. This one a little bit longer, and this one as a result with a closing summary. So once again, pause the video, take a moment to read this message in full, and resume when you're done. Okay, so once again, we can see the main point of this message towards the beginning. It's not the very first sentence or the first few sentences, but it does appear in the first 5 sentences. It appears at the end of that first paragraph. We also see, because this message is a bit longer, that we've got a closing summary towards the very end, right? If your message is long and complex, you want to circle back around at the end and provide a closing summary. In red, we've got the supporting details or supporting context. The bulk of that is indeed following the main point, though you'll see in violet, we've got a little bit of preliminary context, a little bit of preliminary information that precedes the main point. And then finally, in blue, at the very end, we do have that concluding goodwill. Once again, not a feature of routine messages per se, but it is something important to include in all business communication. And then finally, we've got an example of an indirect an indirect routine message that does not include a closing summary, right? This is still a relatively brief message, and the main point already appears at the end, so we don't really need to include a closing summary. So in this case, you'll see in green, you've got the main point. In red, you've got the preliminary context that sets the stage for this strange or unexpected request. And then towards the end, you've got the goodwill in violet. Now, admittedly, I never gave you a chance to pause and read that, so if you want to do that now, that would be great. But otherwise, the main point is that with those strange or unexpected requests, you start out with the context or supporting details to set the scene, to make that strange or unexpected request feel a little less strange or unexpected. You then move on to your main point, and of course, feel free to throw in that goodwill. It's always wonderful. It's always useful. You always want to focus on building and developing those relationships. So to summarize, routine messages, they're routine, right? They're the kinds of messages that you send all the time in a business or workplace context. The good rule of thumb for determining if your message is indeed a routine message is to ask yourself whether the message will upset your audience, whether it will anger them or make them sad. And if the answer to those questions is no, you're writing a routine message, which means that most of the time you're going to be taking that direct approach. Thanks for watching.